I came home after a 16-hour ER shift where we lost a patient. I knocked quietly. A man opened the door and said, "She's in the shower, Doc." When my fiancée heard my voice from the hall. The shift should have ended at midnight, but nothing ever ended on time anymore. The ER had been short 2 nurses, 1 resident had called in sick, and the waiting room never dipped below standing room only. By the time the trauma pager went quiet, my hands smelled like antiseptic and dried blood no matter how many times I washed them. We lost a patient near the end. Cardiac arrest that arrived late and left earlier. The room went silent in that specific way that only happens when everyone knows there is nothing left to try. I signed the time, spoke to the family with the careful language I had learned to use, and walked out without feeling anything sharp enough to name. 16 hours compresses your thinking. It makes decisions automatic and emotions distant. Driving home felt like floating through a tunnel of streetlights, red to green to red again, my mind replaying small procedural details instead of faces. I parked in the same spot I always did, angled too close to the curb, and sat for a moment with the engine off, letting the quiet settle. The building looked the same from the outside, brick darkened by rain, a few windows still lit. Ours was dark. I climbed the stairs slowly, keys already in my hand, then stopped myself out of habit. Vanessa worked from home most days. She hated being startled. I knocked softly, more a tap than anything, expecting to hear her footsteps or her voice drifting through the door. Instead, the door opened almost immediately. The man standing there was not startled at all. He was relaxed in a way that suggested routine. He wore a t-shirt that did not belong to me and gym shorts that were too casual for a guest. His hair was damp, as if he had recently rinsed his face or washed his hands. He looked at me, took in the hospital badge still clipped to my jacket, and smiled like someone who had already decided how the conversation would go. He spoke before I could, addressing me with familiarity and confidence, mentioning that she was showering, using my profession as if it were my name. The words landed wrong, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they were delivered. He stepped back half a pace, leaving the door open, as if inviting me in or expecting me to enter without question. For a second, my body did not react. Exhaustion can do that. It delays the connection between observation and response. I looked past him into the apartment. The lights in the hallway were on. A pair of shoes I did not recognize sat neatly by the wall. Not tossed there, not hidden, but placed carefully, toes aligned. I walked inside without acknowledging him, my movements steady in the way they had been all night. The living room looked mostly the same, but small things were off. A throw pillow had been moved. The coffee table held 2 glasses, one with condensation still clinging to the side. There was a faint scent of a cologne that was not mine and not something Vanessa usually liked. The television was paused on a streaming service profile that was not mine or hers. The man closed the door behind me, still calm, still unhurried. He explained himself in broad terms without urgency, as if this situation had been anticipated and rehearsed. He did not raise his voice. He did not apologize. He did not ask who I was. He already knew. From the bathroom came the sound of the shower running, steady and uninterrupted. Vanessa sang sometimes when she thought she was alone. She did not sing now. I moved down the hallway, each step grounding me further into the moment. The mirror by the closet reflected my face back at me, drawn and older than I felt, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. I looked like someone who had just come from where people died, which made the scene around me feel staged and unreal. Vanessa's voice came from behind the bathroom door when she heard movement in the hall. She said my name, not sharply, but carefully, the way someone speaks when they are buying time. The water did not stop. There was a pause after she spoke, long enough for the weight of the situation to settle into place. The man shifted behind me. I could feel his presence without looking at him. He murmured something about stepping out, about giving us space, as if this were a courtesy rather than a retreat. He moved toward the door, gathering his shoes, still unhurried. When he passed me, there was no embarrassment in his posture. There was calculation and something like relief. He left without incident. The door closed softly behind him. The apartment felt smaller after that, air heavy with things unsaid. The shower finally stopped. Vanessa emerged wrapped in a towel, hair slicked back, eyes scanning my face for cues. She spoke quickly, then slowed when she saw that I was not matching her pace. Her explanation arrived in fragments that did not align. She referenced work stress, loneliness, misunderstandings. She spoke as if this were a recent complication rather than an established pattern. I listened without interrupting, not because I believed her, but because the habit of listening was ingrained. In trauma rooms, interruptions cost lives. Here, they only postponed clarity. As she talked, I noticed more details. The bathroom counter held a toothbrush I did not recognize, placed in a holder that had previously held only mine and hers. The trash can was heavier than usual. A damp towel hung over the back of a chair that was never used for that purpose. These were not signs of a single lapse. They were signs of repetition. Vanessa watched me closely, adjusting her tone when my expression did not change. She framed events around my absence, around the long shifts and missed dinners, around the nights I came home too tired to speak. She suggested that things had drifted without intention, that boundaries had blurred. The words were familiar, drawn from the same shared cultural script that reduced responsibility into circumstance. I asked practical questions, the kind that could not be deflected by emotion. How long? How often? Who else knew? The answers did not arrive cleanly. Timelines shifted. Details were omitted, then reintroduced in altered forms. Each inconsistency widened the space between what I was being told and what I could verify with my own eyes. There was a knock at the door. Vanessa froze. I did not. I opened it to find our neighbor from across the hall, a middle-aged woman who borrowed sugar and complained about noise, but remembered everyone's schedule. She looked between us, then spoke casually, mentioning that the man who had just left had been coming by for weeks, sometimes during the day, sometimes late. She assumed he was family or a colleague. She apologized for interrupting and returned to her apartment without waiting for a response. Vanessa's silence after that was louder than anything she had said before. The story she had been building no longer held its shape. The casual certainty with which the man at the door had spoken earlier took on new meaning. He had not been improvising. He had been operating within a routine that existed before tonight. I sat down at the kitchen table, the chair scraping softly against the floor. Fatigue pressed in from all sides, but clarity cut through it. This was not discovery of an affair. This was discovery of a parallel structure that had been running alongside my life, sustained by my absence and my trust. Vanessa tried again, adjusting her approach, shifting from explanation to appeal. She referenced our engagement, future plans, the shared calendar on the fridge that now felt like a prop. She spoke of fixing things, of slowing down, of understanding. None of it addressed the evidence already laid out across the apartment. I stood and gathered a few essentials without drama. Wallet, keys, phone charger. I moved methodically, the same way I did during handoffs at work. Vanessa followed me from room to room, her voice rising and falling, searching for a reaction that did not come. At the door, I paused, not for her, but to look back at the space one last time. The apartment no longer felt like a place of rest. It felt like a set where scenes had been rehearsed without me. I left and walked down the stairs into the night, the weight of the day finally catching up. Outside, the air was cool and steady. I sat in my car and stared at the building, replaying the man's words, the neighbor's certainty, the small domestic details that told a larger story. The shift had ended. Something else had begun. I slept in the call room that night, not because it was comfortable, but because it was neutral. Hospitals have a way of flattening personal crises. The walls do not care why you are there. The fluorescent lights come on at the same hour regardless. I woke to the sound of carts rolling down the hallway and the smell of burnt coffee, my phone vibrating with missed notifications that I did not check. The absence of messages from Vanessa felt deliberate, like another move in a sequence I had only just begun to see. Morning rounds moved quickly. Muscle memory carried me through patient lists and medication adjustments. I spoke clearly, made decisions, signed off on consults. No one commented on the dark circles under my eyes because they were common currency in that building. During a brief pause at the nurse's station, I overheard a comment about equipment delays and vendor changes, spoken casually, without awareness that it would land on me. A name surfaced in that conversation, the same last name as the man from the night before. The coincidence lodged itself in my mind without forming a conclusion. By midday, administrative emails began arriving, routine on the surface but subtly off in tone. One referenced concerns about my availability for upcoming projects. Another suggested a wellness check-in, framed as support but timed poorly given the circumstances. I had not missed shifts. I had not made errors beyond what fatigue made unavoidable across the department. The language felt pre-written, as if pulled from a template reserved for people already categorized. I drove to a quiet diner after work, the kind that served breakfast all day and did not ask questions. Sitting alone with lukewarm coffee, I reviewed our shared bank account on my phone. The pattern had been there longer than I wanted to admit. Withdrawals spaced evenly, amounts small enough to avoid triggering alarms, subscriptions I did not recognize, expenses logged under vague descriptions. None of it screamed theft. All of it suggested planning. The engagement ring receipts surfaced in my memory, the way Vanessa had insisted on keeping it herself for insurance purposes. At the time, it had felt practical. Now it felt strategic. I returned to the apartment in the late afternoon, not to reconcile, but to retrieve documentation. Vanessa was not there. The space felt staged again, tidied beyond necessity, evidence smoothed over. I gathered financial records, copies of our lease, insurance paperwork. In the bedroom closet, a garment bag hung where mine had never hung before. Inside were clothes that did not belong to me, pressed and arranged as if ready for rotation. A knock came while I was there, firm and confident. I opened the door to find Ryan Porter again, this time in a blazer with a company logo embroidered on the chest. He carried a tablet and a practiced smile, as if the setting had shifted us into a different context where introductions could be reset. He spoke about work overlaps, about upcoming demonstrations at the hospital, about mutual interests. He avoided the personal entirely, as if the night before had been a misunderstanding already resolved. His presence clarified something essential. He was not hiding. He was operating in daylight. Later that evening, Vanessa called. The conversation moved quickly from concern to frustration when she realized I was not returning immediately. She framed my absence as abandonment, my silence as punishment. She spoke of embarrassment, of things being taken out of context, of people already asking questions. The speed with which external perception entered the discussion told me she had been managing narratives long before managing consequences. Over the next few days, fragments accumulated without effort. A colleague mentioned seeing Vanessa at a hospital fundraiser with Ryan weeks earlier, introduced as someone supportive during a difficult time. A nurse asked gently if I was doing all right, referencing rumors without stating them outright. An email from Human Resources proposed adjusting my schedule to reduce stress, citing feedback I had never been given the chance to address. None of it arrived with confrontation. It arrived as accommodation, which made it harder to challenge directly. I met with an administrator to clarify expectations. The conversation stayed polite and procedural. Concerns were expressed about my emotional state, about recent changes at home, about whether I had adequate support. When I asked what prompted those concerns, the answer circled back to general observations and well-meaning reports. No single source was named. The effect was cumulative, designed to feel organic. The realization settled in quietly. Vanessa had not only been preparing to leave, she had been preparing to land. That evening, I found myself parked outside the apartment building again, watching lights switch on and off. Ryan's car was there, parked openly, not tucked away. I did not go inside. I took photographs of the car, not as evidence for a confrontation, but as a marker of reality. I needed to remind myself that what I was seeing was happening. The next escalation came unexpectedly. A billing notice arrived from a private clinic, addressed to Vanessa but charged to our shared account. The services listed were not medical in the conventional sense. They were consultations, coaching sessions framed around transitions, and personal branding. The dates overlapped with my longest shifts, the periods when I had been least available. The language used in those documents mirrored the language now circulating at my workplace. Resilience, boundaries, sustainable performance. The same phrases appeared in emails, in conversations, in printed materials slid across desks with sympathetic nods. I began documenting quietly, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Dates, names, interactions. I did not confront Vanessa with this information. Confrontation would have collapsed the structure before it fully revealed itself. When Vanessa finally returned to the apartment while I was there, the atmosphere shifted. She spoke as if we were coexisting rather than engaged. She outlined timelines, proposed living arrangements, referenced legal considerations casually. The relationship had already been reframed in her mind from personal to logistical. Emotion surfaced only when logistics resisted cooperation. Ryan appeared again, this time announced, stepping into the space with familiarity that bordered on ownership. He spoke about supporting Vanessa, about wanting what was best for everyone involved. His presence was meant to normalize the transition, to present it as already agreed upon. I listened, noting how often my absence was cited as justification, how frequently my profession was invoked as an explanation for decisions I had not made. The narrative positioned me as a risk factor, unpredictable and overextended, while positioning them as stability. The part that broke the illusion came from an unexpected angle. A junior resident approached me after a shift, hesitant, mentioning that someone outside the department had been asking questions about my reliability, presenting themselves as concerned about patient safety. The description matched Ryan too closely to ignore. That was the moment the scope became undeniable. This was no longer about a relationship ending badly. It was about influence being applied across systems that assumed good faith. I left the hospital that night with a clear understanding that passivity would be interpreted as confirmation. The tempo of events was accelerating on its own, fed by overlapping agendas that did not require my participation to continue. I drove past the apartment without stopping and headed somewhere anonymous, somewhere quiet enough to think. The man at the door had not been a surprise guest. He had been a signal, and I had finally learned how to read it. The pressure did not arrive as an explosion. It arrived as alignment. Separate forces that had been drifting finally found the same direction, and once that happened, everything moved faster. The first formal notice reached me midweek. It was framed as routine, an invitation to discuss performance and well-being. The language was neutral, the tone supportive, the timing surgical. It referenced observations rather than incidents, patterns rather than events. I read it twice, then once more for what it did not say. There were no specifics because specifics could be challenged. There was only implication, designed to place me on the defensive without presenting an accusation. I requested documentation. The reply thanked me for my engagement and reiterated concern. Nothing was attached. At work, interactions shifted by degrees. Conversations ended when I approached. Decisions I had historically been looped into were finalized elsewhere. None of it was hostile. Hostility would have been easier. This was distance dressed up as care. Outside the hospital, Vanessa accelerated. She sent messages outlining timelines for separating finances and adjusting the lease, written as if they were mutual decisions already made. She referenced advice she had received, professionals she had consulted. When I asked who, she deflected, suggesting that names were unnecessary at this stage. The implication was clear. She was building authority around herself. Ryan's role clarified further when a vendor meeting was added to my calendar without my input. His company logo sat at the top of the agenda. The meeting concerned equipment I had helped evaluate months earlier. During the session, he spoke with confidence about workflow optimization and clinician burnout, framing his product as a solution. He referenced anecdotal concerns about decision fatigue in emergency settings, phrased as industry knowledge rather than personal critique. I watched colleagues nod along, not because they doubted me, but because the presentation was polished and familiar. He was not attacking me. He was shaping context. Afterward, an administrator thanked him for his insight and asked if he would be available to consult further. The invitation extended beyond equipment. It extended into policy. That night, I reviewed my notes. Dates aligned too cleanly to ignore. Vanessa's coaching sessions preceded changes in her language. Ryan's increased presence at the hospital preceded shifts in perception about my availability. The wellness narrative had been seeded externally, then allowed to grow internally where no one wanted to be seen as dismissive of mental health. The next escalation came through finance. Our shared account was frozen pending review. The notice cited irregular activity and conflicting authorizations. Vanessa claimed surprise, then irritation, then concern. She suggested that my stress might have led to errors. She proposed appointing a temporary manager for household finances. The suggestion was framed as help. I declined and contacted the bank directly. The representative confirmed that the freeze had been requested by one party citing risk. The documentation included language about instability and impaired judgment. It had been submitted calmly, professionally, with attachments that mirrored the phrasing now appearing at work. I did not argue. I asked for copies. The contents were thorough. Screenshots of messages taken out of sequence. Notes from consultations emphasizing the need for safeguards. A narrative that transformed absence into neglect and fatigue into danger. There were no outright falsehoods. There was framing. Vanessa arrived at the apartment later that evening with Ryan in tow. They spoke together, not over each other, presenting a united front. The atmosphere was managerial rather than emotional. They outlined a plan to minimize disruption, to protect assets, to ensure continuity. Ryan positioned himself as support, not replacement, though his proximity contradicted the claim. They expected resistance. What they received was documentation. I laid out timelines without commentary. Dates of coaching sessions. Dates of vendor meetings. Dates of administrative emails. I placed them side by side, not accusing, simply aligning. The effect was immediate. Vanessa's composure tightened. Ryan's posture shifted, attention sharpening in a way that suggested calculation rather than surprise. Vanessa pivoted to accusation, suggesting that my fixation proved her concerns. Ryan suggested mediation. Neither addressed the overlaps directly. The fault line widened the next day at the hospital. An internal review was announced regarding external influence on departmental decisions. The catalyst was unrelated on the surface, a procurement irregularity flagged by compliance. Ryan's name surfaced in that context, not as wrongdoing, but as an overlap requiring clarification. He reacted quickly. Meetings were postponed. His availability decreased. Emails that had once been prompt now arrived delayed and cautious. The confidence he had carried began to fracture under scrutiny. Vanessa reacted differently. She escalated emotionally, contacting my supervisor directly under the guise of concern. The call backfired. The supervisor documented it. noting the unusual nature of a partner inserting herself into internal matters. The note joined a growing file. The junior resident approached me again, this time with confirmation that questions about me had been asked using language that implied imminent risk. The source had been identified as external. The effect was no longer subtle. It was inappropriate. Compliance moved faster after that. Not because of me, but because systems protect themselves when boundaries blur. Ryan's consulting access was reviewed. His informal presence was curtailed. The hospital did not accuse him. It limited him. Vanessa sensed the shift and attempted to reposition herself. She suggested pausing the separation, reframing recent actions as precautionary rather than preparatory. She emphasized shared history. She referenced the ring again, the future again. The words arrived too late. Another consequence landed quietly. The coaching clinic that had billed our account sent an amended invoice, citing a request to adjust descriptions. The original language had been too explicit. The correction was clumsy, creating a paper trail where none had existed before. By the end of the week, the narratives Vanessa had built began colliding with each other. The image of a concerned partner conflicted with documented attempts to manage finances unilaterally. The portrayal of Ryan as peripheral conflicted with his documented involvement across domains. None of this required me to act aggressively. The systems did what systems do when inconsistencies appear. They slowed, then they examined. The final escalation of the part came from an unexpected source. The neighbor from across the hall submitted a statement to building management regarding frequent overnight guests and noise complaints tied to a single unit. The timing coincided with a lease review triggered by Vanessa's earlier inquiries about early termination. The building required clarification. Vanessa's attempt to appear orderly had generated attention she could not control. I packed the remainder of my belongings and moved them out during the day, not to disappear, but to establish separation in fact rather than theory. I informed the hospital of my temporary address and updated emergency contacts. The act was practical, not symbolic. Ryan attempted to contact me once more, proposing a conversation to clear misunderstandings. I declined. There was nothing left to clarify. His leverage depended on proximity and ambiguity. Both were gone. As the week closed, the pressure shifted direction. The structures that had been used to contain me began containing the people who had leaned on them too heavily. Vanessa's certainty fractured. Ryan's confidence thinned. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. The fault line had opened, and the ground was still moving. The consequences had not finished unfolding, but their shape was finally visible. By the time the situation stopped accelerating, the damage had already arranged itself into categories. Personal, professional, financial, reputational. None of them were abstract anymore. Each had a file, a date, a signature. The hospital moved first, not with punishment, but with correction. The internal review concluded that external influence had crossed acceptable boundaries. Language mattered. It allowed action without spectacle. Vendor access was restricted. Informal consultations ended. Procurement protocols tightened. Names were not highlighted in announcements, but the effects were immediate and visible. Meetings Ryan once attended were restructured or canceled. Invitations stopped arriving. The building closed ranks around itself the way institutions do when they recognize exposure. My own position stabilized quietly. The wellness check-in remained, but it changed tone. Documentation I had requested earlier was finally provided, thin and imprecise, unable to support escalation. The supportive distance narrowed. Decisions I had been excluded from returned to my calendar. No one apologized. Stability did not require apology. It required alignment. Vanessa did not adapt as smoothly. The lease issue forced confrontation with reality. Building management required a single point of contact and a clear plan. The neighbor's statement had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. It had described patterns. Patterns demand response. Vanessa's earlier inquiries about early termination now worked against her. The building required documentation she could not produce without contradicting herself. Temporary accommodations turned into deadlines. The financial review concluded with partial releases and conditions. The bank restored access with dual authorization, citing conflicting claims. Vanessa reacted with frustration that slid quickly into anger. She framed the outcome as obstruction, as punishment. The representative reminded her that process was neutral. Neutrality did not yield to tone. The coaching clinic sent a final communication, formal and restrained. They acknowledged billing corrections and confirmed cancellation of services. The message closed with a reminder about disclosure obligations when services intersected with shared finances. The subtext was unmistakable. They were distancing themselves. Ryan's disappearance was gradual, not dramatic. He stopped appearing at the apartment. His car vanished from its usual spot. Messages from him shifted from confident to cautious. then stopped entirely. When his company announced internal restructuring weeks later, his name was absent from the updated leadership page. No reasons were given. Reasons were unnecessary. Vanessa tried to regain control through acceleration. She pushed for mediation, then legal counsel, then negotiation. Each attempt carried the assumption that speed favored her. It did not. Every move required alignment across narratives she could no longer synchronize. She attempted to contact my supervisor again. This time, the response was brief and documented. The boundary was reinforced without explanation. She reached out to colleagues I had worked with for years, framing concern, asking questions that suggested risk. The reception was colder than she anticipated. Professional communities are wary of outsiders who speak too fluently about internal matters. The engagement ended without ceremony. There was no announcement. There were no statements to friends. The ring remained with the insurer pending instruction. The future that had been discussed so often in abstract terms resolved into logistics handled by third parties. I returned to a routine that felt different not because it had changed, but because the weight of carrying two lives had lifted. Shifts remained long. The work remained heavy. Patients still arrived too late and left too early. The difference was internal. I was no longer buffering someone else's strategy with my exhaustion. Vanessa's consequences unfolded unevenly. Social circles thinned as stories conflicted. Professional opportunities she had referenced evaporated when follow-up questions arrived. The people who had supported her during the transition hesitated once stability required accountability rather than sympathy. Support is easiest when it costs nothing. Ryan's name surfaced once more, indirectly, during a compliance update that mentioned revised policies on vendor relationships. The language was careful. The effect was final. Influence had been replaced by oversight. Months later, I ran into Vanessa by chance in a public place, the kind where encounters cannot be staged. The interaction was brief. She spoke about moving forward, about lessons learned. The phrasing echoed earlier coaching language, but without conviction. The structure remained. The substance had thinned. I returned to work and took on additional responsibility, not as a statement, but because capacity had returned. The department adjusted around me the way it always had when reliability was demonstrated rather than claimed. Trust reaccumulates slowly, but it does accumulate. The last administrative thread resolved when the bank closed its review, noting that no further action was required. Neutral language again. Neutrality had become my ally. There was no moment of triumph. There was only the steady realization that systems, when allowed to function without interference, favor coherence over performance. The people who had tried to bend them without understanding their limits had miscalculated. The man at the door had assumed familiarity equaled access. Vanessa had assumed preparation equaled control. Both had relied on my absence to sustain their momentum. Absence had ended that night. What followed was not recovery in the cinematic sense. It was recalibration. The work continued. The noise quieted. The parallel structure collapsed under its own contradictions. And the life I inhabited, singular again, held its shape.